As I was putting these stories together today, I started thinking about the fact that there are all of the monsters that we know about, the skinwalkers, the Bigfoots. But what happens when the terror comes from something that we can't identify? So come and join me with my traditional glass of crabapple liqueur as we explore some of these unknowns in these next 5 stories. Andy and his cousin Patty were in their early 20s when they met up with their families for their annual family camping trip on a remote lake up in Lassen County, California. And as usual, they pretty much had the lake to themselves because most people would go to the much bigger, more popular Lake Al Manor a short distance away. One day, Andy and Patty decide they want to go take a hike. Now, this lake is so small that they really don't have any cultivated hiking trails on it. So they decide that they are going to follow a creek that leads up the mountain from a lake that's nearby to their campsite. That way, all they have to do is follow that creek back down and they know they won't get lost. They start out by crossing a meadow, which takes them to the lake and the creek, and they join the creek and they start following the creek up the mountain, which is densely forested with pine trees all over. And just a little ways up, they came to a huge, tangled, uprooted root system of a huge fallen tree right next to the creek. And considering both Andy and Patty are lovers of all things fairy folk and forest, they both think this kind of looks like a gnome's house. Maybe he's the guardian of the forest. So they both give a little nod of appreciation and say, "Thank you for allowing us to enter your forest." And a little ways further, Andy all of a sudden realizes that he's been hearing this slow, rhythmic beat for a long time now that seems like it's coming from somewhere out in the forest. It was a slow, dull, steady beat, like somebody hitting a drum. And Andy asks Patty, who lives in a small town not far from Yosemite, if she has any idea what might be making this noise. And Patty says, "I don't know. It doesn't sound like loggers or hikers or animals or anything else that she can think of." So they shrug it off and keep hiking up the hill. And they fall quiet for a while, just kind of plodding along. And the sound continues to grow louder or closer. And Andy looks out into the forest to see if he can see where it might be coming from, but all he sees are trees in every direction. And the sound is starting to make him feel kind of uneasy and a little anxious. And he's also noticing that he's feeling tired, but not tired in a way that you've been hiking too long. Tired more like his brain is getting foggy and everything kind of feels dreamlike. And Andy looks over at Patty, and she looks a little spaced out too. So he asks her, "Are we at like a high altitude or something?" And she says, "Well, no, not really. We're actually, if you look, we haven't really gone that far from the lake." So Andy tells her he's asking because he's feeling kind of funny. And Patty says, "I am too." But they keep hiking, and the drumming sound gets noticeably louder. And it's coming from all around them. It's this slow, steady beat that starts to vibrate in Andy's ears and thumps in his chest right next to his heart. And that's when things start to get really weird. Andy no longer feels anxious about this hike. In fact, just the opposite. He's starting to feel this really deep, deep sense of peace. Like he's asleep and dreaming. And he just keeps putting one foot in front of the other, climbing the mountain. But it was like he was in a trance. Like he wasn't making the decision to keep going, more like he was just being drawn upward. And they just kept hiking in total silence for a long time, continually just climbing that mountain, with the pounding getting louder and louder. Eventually, they reach a place where a waterfall tumbles down from a rock ledge maybe 6 feet over their head. And it's an easy walk to get up and around it to get to the next tier of the creek. But Andy stops, and Patty stops right next to him. In kind of a daze, they both look at the beautiful pool that's being formed by that waterfall. It's covered in ferns and moss, and the bottom of the pool is made up of all these beautiful colored rocks. And the drumbeat is faster now. It's close and enveloping, and it still seems to be coming from nowhere. Andy looks at the falls and feels this intense longing to keep going, to continue past those falls and keep going up that mountain forever and discover all the beauty that it has to offer. But they both just stand there still for a long time until Patty says, "I think if we keep going, we don't ever get to come back." And Andy looks at her in unspoken agreement and all of a sudden feels a flash of adrenaline. They both turn and start heading down the mountain. And as they descend, the fog in their head starts to clear, the drumbeat starts to fade, and Andy feels more and more the urgency to get away from there. Once he gets to where he finally feels awake again, and he is leaping and tripping over things to get down that mountain as fast as he can. Eventually, they get back down to that big uprooted tree on the side of the creek. They both say thank you to the imaginary gnome forest guardian and keep going. And they keep going until they hit that meadow. Once they hit the meadow, they slow down a bit, and Andy says, "Wow, do we have active imaginations?" They get to the other side of the meadow where they finally turn and look back at the mountain. And at just that moment, an unmistakable "Yoop!" comes from exactly where they were on that mountain. Every hair on Andy's body stands up. And he just knows that had they not turned around at that waterfall, they never would have come down that mountain again. Amber's family goes camping in Joshua Tree National Park twice a year. And this has been going on for like 60 years. And in all of that time, they have only left early twice. Once was when 4 inches of rain flooded out their campsite at 4 a.m. The second is much more terrifying, and they still don't have an answer as to what happened. So it's the first night of camping on this particular trip, and 12-year-old Amber is in a tent with all of her girl cousins. And about 10 feet away is the tent with all of the boy cousins. There's about 6 of them. And then a little ways from them is another tent with all of the adults. It's her mom and dad and about 3 or 4 sets of aunts and uncles. There's probably about 20 people in all. And most of the tents are the kind where you can unzip the top so you have a window at the top that you can look through. And Amber loves this because she's not a very good sleeper. It always takes her a long time to fall asleep. So if the window is open, she can at least look out at the stars. Now, it had been a pretty big day, first day of camping and everything, so Amber's actually kind of tired. And she's laying down and she's just relaxing, just getting to sleep, when a pebble falls from the boulder right next door to them, right onto the top of her tent. Now, she doesn't really think anything of it because by now she knows that there's lots of nighttime critters that will knock debris around like sticks and small rocks while they are foraging for food. But it was enough of a noise to make Amber open her eyes. And the first thing that she sees is a face from the top of the boulder about 15 feet above her, staring down at all of the tents. The person seemed to be wearing really tight clothes, and they were really skinny and oddly shaped. And at first, she just tells herself it's one of her boy cousins because they had been trying to scare the girls all night. But the person is moving really weird. It keeps moving its head back and forth like a cobra, and crouching down on all fours and climbing down the side of the rock near the tents, and then crawling back up and pacing around. At one point, it hears somebody in a different campsite making some noise. It looks over there, and Amber sees its eyes gleam in the moonlight. And Amber can clearly see that it doesn't have the skull shape of a coyote or a mountain lion. It has a flat face and no snout. So Amber's lying in her tent, freaking out, trying to rationalize what it is that she's seeing. And as time goes by, this thing continues to just watch them and move around in really strange ways. And she thinks about screaming, but this thing is crawling down the side of the boulder, and she's afraid if she screams, it'll jump onto the tent and kill them. And after some time, Amber hears, "Hey, what the heck? Hey, what are you doing?" It's her uncle. And suddenly, it's like 3 a.m. and everyone is awake. The other girls in her tent are now all awake and confused, and 2 of her male cousins jump out of their tent with axes. And for a few seconds, the thing just stands still until Amber's aunt and a few of her other cousins see it, and they all start screaming. And someone finds a flashlight and they turn it on, but the thing jumps off the backside of the boulder. A couple seconds later, the thing comes out from behind the rock and gallops past their campsite. And her uncle manages to flash a light on it for just a second. And Amber still doesn't quite understand what it is that she saw, but she knows it wasn't wearing any clothes. And a few seconds later, they hear screaming and thrashing coming from another campsite. So a couple of her cousins run over that way to go investigate. Whatever that thing was, it escaped from their campsite over to the next campsite and ran straight into a 2-person tent. When the Rangers finally get there, it's like 4 a.m. and everyone is confused. Her uncle and the people from the campsite next door, they say it was a naked person, but Amber doesn't think it was a person. And luckily for her, 2 of her male cousins were also watching it at the same time she was and being terrified by it as well. They agree with Amber. So everybody gives the Rangers all of the details that they can. And one of the Rangers says it's probably a coyote or a mountain lion with mange. But the other Ranger looks kind of concerned, and Amber thinks that he went off to go look for it. Either way, it was too big for a coyote. And since Amber used to track mountain lions in college, and she knows they don't move that way, she does not believe it was a mountain lion with mange. They all left and went home that night because either there's a naked crazy person, a monster, or a mountain lion with mange running around their campsites. And it had spent at least an hour watching them. No, thank you. When Carly and Bill first moved into their new house, Carly kept thinking she heard somebody walking around when she was alone. Now, the house is in a flood zone, so it's on stilts, which makes it really easy to hear when anyone is walking inside the house. And being in Texas, the first thing that Carly would do is grab her handgun, go check out the house, but she never found anything. And she just keeps feeling like she's going to walk into a room one day and somebody's going to be there. She just keeps feeling like she's being watched, and this goes on for several days. And Bill doesn't really think anything of it until one night he jumps out of bed, grabs his handgun, and starts going through the house. And he is going through so fast and opening doors so fast, they're slamming against the walls. And he tells Carly he knows he hears somebody in the kitchen, like somebody's going through the pantry. He is adamant that he hears somebody. But nobody's there. Doors are all still locked. House is clear. Now their niece Amy, who's been staying with them for a while, but was staying with her grandma and grandpa for a while Carly and Bill made the move, she comes back to stay in the new house. And after a few nights, she comes knocking on Bill and Carly's room one night and asks if she can stay in their room on a cot. Now, Amy is a teenager. She's not a little kid who's going to scare easily. So Carly asks her, well, what's wrong? And Amy just said, I don't want to tell you because you're not going to believe me. I just don't want to be alone. But Carly gently prods her a little bit, saying, Honey, you can tell me anything. It's okay. I promise I will believe you. And Amy finally tells her that she heard somebody banging around in the kitchen. And then she saw a man's face in her window. So she just bailed out of her room and she doesn't really want to go back. And the next morning, everybody seemed to be just a little bit on edge. And Carly and Amy are sitting in the kitchen having breakfast when Bill comes in. And keep in mind, Bill is a notorious non-believer in the paranormal. But he looks visibly shaken. And he tells Carly and Amy, I was just bringing Amy's laundry up to her room when I saw a man smiling at me through Amy's window. But the windows on the house are 20 feet above the ground because of the stilts that the house sits on. One time, when Todd was about 14, he was staying at his friend Kurt's house. Kurt had bunk beds, and Todd called the top. And the two boys went to sleep like normal. But Todd had a dream that he saw a hooded man standing in the doorway of their bedroom. The man walked in and stood staring at both boys in the room. And when the man looks at Todd, he feels ice cold and sick to his stomach. And there is an overwhelming sense of dread running all the way through him. And he doesn't want to call attention to himself by calling for help. So he just lays there, dead still. And the hooded man comes closer and leans down toward Kurt on the bottom bunk. And Todd is scared for his friend, but at the same time, he's really glad the attention isn't on him. And there's an ungodly noise coming from the hooded figure, a low, deep rumbling that grew louder and louder until it started to hurt Todd's ears. And he remembers hoping that it was loud enough to wake Kurt's parents, but at the same time, he knew that he and Kurt were trapped in there alone. And the hooded man continues his rumbling scream until a never-ending swarm of insects comes out of the hood and starts buzzing all around the room. And Todd remembers them buzzing his face, but he's too scared to move to swat them away. And the bugs keep flying out, and soon the room is filled with them. And at that point, Todd thinks he must have passed out because he does not remember what happened next. The next morning, Todd and Kurt are in the kitchen having some breakfast when Kurt's dad comes in and asks him if they slept well. And Todd replies, well, I had a nightmare that scared the hell out of me. And Kurt replies, so did I. And Kurt said he dreamt that he had thousands of bugs crawling all over him. So Todd tells them about his nightmare, and both boys are creeped the hell out. Luckily, Kurt's family moved into a new house not long after that night, because there is no way in hell Todd was ever going to stay in that house again. Janie's house has a wrap-around porch, and the backside of the porch butts right up against the woods. And there's no backyard, because literally the porch goes right up to the thick of the woods. And she and her boyfriend Ken like to spend nights out on that porch with the lights off, just enjoying the night sky. And one night, she and Ken are both sitting out on that back porch when they hear heavy footsteps. Like the heaviest footsteps Janie's ever heard in her life. It's like a two-legged elephant walking on her porch. Now, her porch is long, and she and Ken are sitting at one end, and the footsteps are coming from the other end. And as those footsteps are getting closer, Janie yells to Ken to get up and turn on the lights. Now, Ken is a fairly big dude and not afraid of much. So he just starts yelling, thinking that it's just a wild animal and he can just scare it away. But the steps speed up and it starts coming at them faster. Now it is pitch black and Ken can't find the lights. So he gets up to turn around to try to get the porch switches. And Janie feels this whoosh of wind on her back. she hears the steps slam past her on its way to the other end of the porch. And just before Ken hits the lights, she hears two final sounds. The first is that whatever it is grabbed the railing and pressed off of it to jump over the railing. And second, whatever it is that jumped lands. And Janie hears the big, huge, heavy elephant feet hit the ground. And the lights turn on and Janie runs over to the railing to where she thinks it landed. But nothing is there. Janie freaks out and she turns around and looks at Ken, who she has never seen be afraid of anything, and he's visibly shaken. So they hurry up and go inside, lock all the doors, drink a beer, and talk about what had just happened. And neither of them can understand why neither of the two motion lights that are mounted on either end of that porch turned on. But they did agree never to sit out on the porch in the dark again. And if those stories were just not quite enough for you, go ahead and click right here for some more adrenaline rushes. And we'll see you again on the In-Between.